commodity markets are forward looking. And I think commodity markets today are taking into account the possibility, if not the probability, of a global recession.
I've seen the commodities versus Dow Industrial Average chart, and it shows commodities to be most undervalued in 120 years. At a time when we have more people on the planet than ever before and are producing things faster, yet consuming more, how can commodities lag behind stocks so badly?
I think that in some senses, forward commodity prices are a function of two things. One, maybe three things. The incredible efficiency with which extractive industries, oil and gas and mining industries, discovered new resources and reserves in the 1970s and 1980s, particularly because exploration began to take place outside of familiar terrains, which is to say, as an example, African deposits, Asian deposits, South American deposits were brought into production. Two, technology has allowed us to be much more efficient in the utilization of resources, which is to say, our fabrication efficiencies through technology are much greater than they used to be. So a barrel of oil or a ton of copper goes a lot further with today's recovery and fabrication technologies than it did 40 years ago. But also, commodity markets are forward looking. And I think commodity markets today are taking into account the possibility, if not the probability, of a global recession. We've gone for a very long time without a recession. And despite the fact that everybody sees that supply shortages are going to happen relative to our traditional productive capacity, people are concerned that demand will suffer too in the event of a global recession. I agree with your assertion that commodity prices are unrealistically low viewed against a 100 or 150-year time frame. I would postulate further, and I'm happy to defend this in some future interview, that as a society we have been underinvesting in the productive capacity around industrial commodities, oil, gas, uranium, copper, the whole range. We've been underinvesting as a society for 30 years, not just for 10 years. And the consequence of that is inevitably that we will continue to experience short supplies of commodities, particularly as the population on Earth continues, and particularly, too, as we do an admirable job, as we have done in the last 30 years, in increasing the material living standards of the poorest of the poor. It's important to remember in any discussion like we're having, Patrick, that over 1 billion people on Earth have no access to electricity. And another 2 billion people on Earth have access to only intermittent or unaffordable electricity. Those people want to live like you and I do. And when poorer people get more money, the type of purchases that add utility to them and their families are almost always material. When you make more money, you buy a service or maybe some little gadget from Apple, which doesn't require very much by way of raw material. But when a poorer person acquires more purchasing power, they increase the calorie count and the calorie quantity in their family. They trade a bicycle for a 50cc motorcycle and a 50cc motorcycle for a Toyota Hilux, which is to say, in every circumstance, when the poorest 3 billion people on Earth get additional spending power, what they spend the money on is commodity intensive. And that demographic wave of demand is running into a supply crunch that stems from 30 years of underinvestment in productive capacity, which is itself exacerbated by politics, by increased social take by way of taxes and fees, by permitting and regulatory regimes that prohibit, never mind the construction of new mines, but even, in fact, exploration for same. So it's going to be an interesting period of time for people in the commodities business, and I suspect a very pleasant period of time for companies and individuals that own long-lived, high-quality reserves, which will be very tough to replace given the level of investment activity that's taking place now.
Yeah, Rick, that's an interesting point. Why would politicians stop the exploration of resources and all of these things? Why would they stop investing and going back into these natural resources?
I can only speculate, but there is a preference among some citizens in the developed nature uh, for a sort of a Luddite future. Uh, Perhaps it's that people in places like the left coast of the United States have theirs, and they care less about the well being of people who don't have theirs. The suggestion, as an example, that we're going to be able to feed 8 billion people in the globe with organic farms, I think is part of the same social ethos that causes us not to be able to build pipelines, not to be able to build power plants, not to be able to build the power grid, and in many jurisdictions, not to be able to even permit the exploration, never mind the development of resources that the world needs to lift up into material prosperity the poorest of the poor.